There's a green, corroded lump of bronze sitting behind glass in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens that has spent more than a century making historians rewrite what they thought they knew about the ancient world. It doesn't look like much. A stranger walking past the case might mistake it for a piece of ship hardware or a rusted clock someone's grandfather threw in a drawer. But inside that corrosion is a machine with more than 30 interlocking gears, a machine that modeled the motion of the sun and moon to the sky, tracked the 4-year cycle of the ancient Olympic Games, and predicted eclipses decades in advance. Built somewhere around the 2nd century BC, in a world that, as far as we can tell from everything else that survives from antiquity, had no business building anything like it. Nothing else close to this level of mechanical sophistication shows up in a historical record again for well over 1,000 years. That gap is the whole reason this object has obsessed scientists, historians, and engineers for over a century. Not because anyone needed to invent a dramatic story about it. The true story already refuses to make sense. In the spring of 1900, a crew of Greek sponge divers from the island of Simi took shelter from a storm near a small, barren island called Antikythera, wedged in the strait between Crete and the Peloponnese. Sponge diving in that era was brutal and dangerous work. Divers went down in heavy canvas suits and copper helmets, breathing through hand-cranked air pumps, often for minutes at a time at depths that would give a modern recreational diver pause. When the weather cleared, one of the divers went down to check whether the seabed nearby was worth working. He came back up badly shaken, describing a pile of bronze and marble bodies on the seafloor. His captain assumed the classic hazard of deep diving, nitrogen narcosis, sometimes called a rapture of the deep, had scrambled the man's senses. So the captain went down himself. He found the same thing. They weren't bodies. They were statues, an entire cargo of Greek sculpture, bronze and marble, scattered across the slope of a Roman-era shipwreck that had gone down around 60 BC, most likely carrying looted or purchased Greek art toward Rome. The wreck sat at a depth of around 45 meters, technically survivable for the diving technology in 1900, but genuinely dangerous, and the excavation that followed, conducted with the Greek Navy's help over the following year, became one of the earliest major underwater archaeological operations in history. Divers were paid by the piece, worked in brutal conditions, and at least one diver died of decompression sickness during the recovery. It's worth remembering that real people paid a real price to bring this material to the surface. Among the bronze statues, glassware, jewelry, and coins pulled from the wreck was a much less glamorous find. A shoebox-sized, badly corroded lump of bronze and wood, catalogued without much excitement. It sat in storage in Athens for months. Then, as the wood casing dried out and cracked, the lump split open, and someone noticed a gear wheel embedded inside it, precisely cut teeth on a device that was supposed to be a wreck from 60 BC. That single gear is the reason we're still talking about this today. For decades after that, almost nobody could say with confidence what the object actually did. Early 20th century historians noted the gearing and speculated it might be some kind of astronomical instrument, but the fragments were fragile, encrusted, and hard to study without damaging them further, and the tools available, magnifying glasses, early photography, patience, could only reveal so much. The real turning point came from a British historian of science named Derek de Solla Price, who became fascinated with the mechanism in the 1950s and spent years studying it, working from gamma-ray and X-ray images that let him see gear teeth without breaking the fragments open. Price counted teeth wheel by wheel, worked out the ratios between interlocking gears, and connected those ratios to known astronomical cycles. Gear ratios aren't arbitrary. If a wheel with a given number of teeth drives another wheel with a different number, that ratio encodes a mathematical relationship, and if you know your ancient astronomy, you can often recognize what cycle it was built to track. Price published his findings in 1974, describing the mechanism as a geared analog computer for calculating astronomical positions, and for a generation, his account was essentially the whole story, a hand-cranked device that modeled the movements of the sun and moon. Price's reconstruction was genuinely brilliant work done with primitive imaging tools, but it was also built on an incomplete picture. Only about a third of the original mechanism survives today, split across roughly 82 fragments of wildly varying size, the largest few substantial and readable, dozens of the rest tiny corroded scraps. Price, and later the British clockmaker and horologist Michael Wright, who built several working physical reconstructions in the 1990s and 2000s, and pushed the field further by proposing that the front dial also display the positions of the 5 planets known to antiquity, were working with a puzzle missing most of its pieces, using the tools of their era to make the most defensible inferences they could. The next real leap didn't come from a better guess. It came from a machine. In 2005, an international research collaboration called the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project bringing together historians, mathematicians, astronomers, and imaging specialists, including Tony Freeth, Mike Edmonds, Alexander Jones, Yanis Bitsakis, and others, brought a purpose-built industrial X-ray computed tomography scanner to Athens. The device, built by the UK firm X-Tech Systems and nicknamed Blade Runner by the team, weighed around 8 tons and was powerful enough to be shipped to fragments rather than risk moving the fragile bronze pieces to it. It could image the mechanism slice by slice, in 3 dimensions, seeing through nearly 2,000 years of calcified corrosion the way a hospital CT scanner sees through soft tissue. What it found was extraordinary. Buried inside the corrosion, in a layer no human eye had read since antiquity, were thousands of tiny inscribed Greek letters, a kind of instruction manual engraved directly onto mechanism's plates, describing what its dials and pointers were meant to show. The CT data also revealed gear teeth and structures that earlier imaging had missed entirely, including confirmation of gear counts and mechanisms nobody had been able to see clearly before. Separately, the team used a technique called polynomial texture mapping, essentially raking light across the surface of the fragments from dozens of angles and combining the images computationally to bring out surface detail invisible to the naked eye, to read inscriptions on the outer casing that had been illegible for a century. Together, these 2 imaging breakthroughs let researchers read roughly 10 times more surviving text than had been legible before, and it let them build a far more complete gear train model than Price or Wright had been able to construct. The team's major findings, published starting in 2006 in the journal Nature and in follow-up papers over the following decade, confirmed and extended the picture. The mechanism modeled the sun and moon's position against the zodiac, displayed the moon's phase using a rotating half-silvered, half-blackened ball, tracked a 19-year lunar solar cycle called a metonic cycle on a spiral dial on the back, tracked a 4-year cycle of Panhellenic Games, including the Olympics, and, most remarkably, used a spiral eclipse prediction dial based on an 18-year cycle called the Saros cycle, complete with small glyphs marking when specific eclipses were predicted to occur, including some detail about their character, drawn from a much older tradition of Babylonian eclipse observation that the Greeks appear to have inherited and mechanized. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it's the real version of the machine describes what an eclipse will look like, claim that shows up in the fabricated scripts. It's not invented. The inscriptions genuinely do include notations tied to specific predicted eclipses. What's misleading in those other videos isn't the existence of eclipse detail. It's dressing it up as a brand new AI discovery when it's been published peer-reviewed research since the mid-2000s. Here's where the story gets genuinely unresolved, and where I want to be careful not to overstate things the way the fabricated scripts do. Even after the 2005 CT scan, a real question remained open. Did the mechanism's front dial also display the positions of the 5 planets visible to the naked eye, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, the way Michael Wright argued in the 1990s and 2000s? The problem is that almost none of the physical gearing for a planetary display survives. If it existed, it's part of the roughly 2/3 of the mechanism that was lost to the sea before 1900. What does survive are inscriptions referencing planetary cycles, some tantalizing gear fragments and mounting points that don't fit neatly into the confirmed lunar solar system, and a badly damaged inscription on the mechanism's back cover, sometimes called a back cover inscription, or, in some readings, connected to a table nicknamed the Olympiad dial or Games dial, that appears to reference planetary period relationships used in Babylonian and Greek astronomy. In 2021, a team based at University College London, led by Tony Freeth and including mathematician Aris Koutros and mechanical engineer Adam Wojcik, published a paper proposing a specific gear system that could have generated a planetary display consistent with the surviving inscriptions and the physical constraints of the case, the sizes of surviving mounting points, the spacing that would have to fit inside the known housing. To do this, they didn't just eyeball it the way Price or Wright had to. They used computational modeling, essentially treating the problem as a mathematical optimization, testing large numbers of possible gear train configurations against every known constraint. Tooth counts implied by inscriptions, known astronomical period relationships from Babylonian, records of Greeks are known to have used physical space limits from the surviving casing, and narrowing down to arrangements that could satisfy all of them simultaneously. It's fair to call that a real ancestor of the let a machine search the possibility space idea that shows up, exaggerated, in the viral scripts. It is genuinely striking, careful work. But it's important to say plainly, this is a proposed, debated reconstruction, not a confirmed discovery. Because the physical gearing for a planetary display doesn't survive, no computational model, however rigorous, can prove it existed in exactly that form. It can only show that a particular arrangement is consistent with everything we do have, and is at least plausible given the physical constraints. Other researchers have proposed different planetary gearing schemes over the decades, with different tooth counts and different mechanical solutions, and a debate over exactly what the front dial displayed, and whether it displayed planets mechanically at all, as opposed to some other astronomical function, is still actively discussed in the specialist literature. Nobody serious in this field claims the question is closed, and nobody serious frames a mathematical optimization exercise as a machine itself waking up or insisting on an answer. That's marketing language grafted onto real science by people trying to get views. Strip away the invented drama, and what's left is still one of the most remarkable objects to survive from the ancient world, for reasons that don't need embellishment. Somebody in the 2nd or 1st century BC. We don't know who, and probably never will, since the mechanism carries no maker's signature, understood the mathematics of lunar and solar cycles well enough to encode them in a train of bronze gears small enough to fit in a wooden box, roughly the size of a large book, then hand-cranked that box to answer questions about the sky years or decades into the future. Whoever built it wasn't inventing the underlying astronomy from scratch. The metonic cycle, the Saros cycle, and detailed planetary period relationships were tracked for centuries by Babylonian astronomers using clay tablets and arithmetic, and Greek astronomers, plausibly including figures in the tradition of Hipparchus of Rhodes, whose lunar theory some of the mechanism's gearing seems to reflect, inherited and refined that knowledge. What's unprecedented isn't the astronomy. It's that someone translated that astronomy into a working mechanical system, interlocking gears, some with tooth counts as specific and deliberate as 223 or 127 or 19, chosen because those exact numbers approximate real astronomical cycles as closely as the available gear sizes allowed. Cutting 53 teeth instead of 50 or 55 is an accident. It's evidence of someone who had already done the math and was translating it, tooth by tooth, into a physical object. And then, as far as the archaeological and historical record shows, nobody built anything comparably sophisticated again for well over 1,000 years. The next gear mechanical devices approaching this level of complexity that survive in historical record are medieval and early modern European astronomical clocks, built from the 14th century onward, more than 1,400 years after the Antikythera mechanism went down with its ship. There are scattered references in later ancient and Byzantine texts to gear devices, and some historians argue there may have been a continuous, thinner tradition of mechanical astronomy that simply didn't survive in physical form, passed down, and eventually influencing Islamic and then European instrument makers. But the physical evidence for that chain is thin. What we can say with confidence is that the specific, staggeringly precise expression of it, the Antikythera mechanism itself, appears to be either a singular achievement or the sole survivor of a tradition that has otherwise vanished almost without a trace. That's the genuinely unsettling part of the true story, and you don't need a fabricated AI plot twist to get there. A device this sophisticated existed. The people capable of building it are anonymous. Whatever tradition of craftsmanship produced, it seems to have largely died with it, or at least gone underground for over a millennium before anything similar resurfaces. We are still, in 2026, actively arguing in peer-reviewed journals about exactly what all its dials showed, based on real fragments, real CT data, and real computational modeling, not because the answer is being deliberately hidden, but because 2/3 of the object is genuinely, physically gone, dissolved into the Aegean seabed over 19 centuries before anyone thought to go looking for it. One more thing worth saying honestly. The 1900 to 1901 excavation of the Antikythera wreck was cut short by the technology and funding of its time, and researchers have long suspected the wreck site still holds material that was never recovered. Modern expeditions, including a series of dives conducted by a Swiss-led team using rebreather technology between 2014 and the early 2020s, in collaboration with the Greek effort of underwater antiquities, have returned to the site and recovered additional artifacts, including bronze and marble fragments, a bronze arm from a statue, ship components, and human remains, though not, so far, additional fragments of the mechanism itself. Whether more of it is still down there, buried under sediment or scattered further than the original survey reached, remains an open question. It's one of the more grounded reasons this story isn't finished. Not because the machine is about to reveal a secret, but because there's a real shipwreck, partially explored, that might still have more to say. So here's the honest version of the question the fabricated scripts are trying to manufacture drama around, because the honest version turns out to be interesting enough on its own. We have a machine from the ancient world more mechanically sophisticated than anything else known to survive from over 1,000 years on either side of it. We can read a large fraction of its own user manual, engraved by its maker directly onto the bronze. We know with real confidence that it tracked the sun, the moon, a 19-year lunar cycle, an 18-year eclipse cycle, and a 4-year cycle of Greek athletic games. We have serious, peer-reviewed, computationally rigorous arguments, not viral video claims, that it may also have modeled the 5 visible planets, though that piece isn't settled. And we don't know who built it, whether it was one genius or a workshop or the last surviving example of a broader,